Welcome to Funnel Lab Fridays. Funnel Lab Fridays is a weekly LinkedIn Live series where we dive deeply into use cases and challenges data savvy marketers face. I'm your guest host, Doug Bell. I run marketing here at Caliber Mind. I'm also a partner and CMO with Chief Outsiders, and I'm stepping in for our host, Eric Westerkamp, who's on vacation this week. Joining me today are Nick Zangre and Ali Rostiello of Health Catalyst. Today, Nick, Ali, and I will be talking about transitioning a traditional funnel to an intent-based model. Welcome, Nick. Welcome, Ali. Nick, welcome back. This is probably your third or fourth go round on the show.
Yeah, good to be
Thanks for
back.
hanging in there with us. Good to have you, buddy. I know in a former life you were a member of the Pedowitz group, so I'm going to imagine the transition that Ali and I and you and are going to be talking about is something you're really familiar with. So I'm going to come back to you in a couple minutes to get your thoughts as Ali sort of unpacks what she's working on. Ali, welcome to the Funnel Lab.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's great to have you. Tell us a little bit about your role. Tell us about Health Catalyst. And then we want to dig into what is a traditional funnel, and we want to talk about that transition you're experiencing.
Yeah, sure. So my role is VP of RevOps. I am an actual RevOps person where I do own marketing and sales operations and analytics and what would be customer expansion sort of support. Our company is it's healthcare analytics platforms for hospitals. So we sell solely to hospitals. Being in that healthcare space makes us very traditional in the way that we go to market, just because hospitals they are not your typical B2B technology buyer type situation. They just aren't. So they like a lot of in-person events. They like a lot of in-person meetings. So our sales team is constantly traveling. So when we start talking about like our tech stack and all of those things, we have to think about the fact that we are not born of the digital age. That's not really what our selling process is. It's still very kind of old school. So that's sort of what we mean by that traditional funnel. We don't have a lot of conversion off the website. We don't have a lot of nurturing that happens via email. There's high security with the hospitals too. So a lot of times they will block out any external emails coming in that seem like marketing emails. They'll just block them all the way. So we have to find different ways to get in front of those people.
And when we talked the other day, Ali, about this, you sort of expressed it in a waterfall approach, which is to say your top of funnel is represented by a lot of in-person events.
Mhm.
And then once you have those prospects in your database or you have them interested, you're using webinars and other content to accelerate them to the
Yep.
bottom of the funnel. And then you have a fairly traditional sort of selling process. And you talked about sort of that as the start. Then obviously you're somebody with a lot of experience sort of working in maybe more sort of cutting edge environments in terms of
More digital
making sure that
forward.
more digital forward. I think it's a better way to describe it. And you recently made the decision to begin transitioning to more of an intent-based approach. So maybe tell us about some of the reasoning there and tell us what that sort of leading edge looks like for you.
Yeah. So the big part for that of that for us is that we do know that we have to start doing an account-based approach in general, meaning that we have to start talking to all of the buyers in the hospitals, everybody that's involved in that decision. So that was like our first sort of realization that like we've built a lot of relationships with our current client base, and now we need to figure out how to expand those footprints and get into other segments of the hospital, other child hospitals, because the hospital systems have these very layered ownerships. So like one hospital system can have like parent, grandparent, great grandparent accounts, right? So like how do you penetrate all the way through that and make sure that you're hitting all of the right people in those hospitals and really, forging those relationships. So that was one aspect of it. And the second part of that aspect is how do we be more efficient with our dollars? It is expensive to travel and do big events in person. It is expensive to, pay for content or pay for media. How do we make sure that the things that we are doing to get in front of those buyers are really making the most sense and getting the most bang for our dollar. So we want to focus on accounts that we see are in market, are focused on the pain points that our solutions solve for, and are seem to be looking for better ways to slice and dice their data and pull it all together and get insights and make measurable impacts that, affect lives in hospitals.
So, Nick, you have helped either at Caliber Moyne or at the Pedowitz Group. You've helped a lot of organizations make these transitions, and we're sort of using this broad term. We're saying traditional, but sort of making the move from more in person, maybe more sort of, if you will, offline marketing and selling to more online marketing and selling. What are some of those things that people can step in during that transition? Things to look out for, because I think what we all want to talk about is what are those milestones to really making it up that curve to the point where you are in maybe more of an engagement or enterprise, sorry, engagement or intent based model.
Yeah, sure. So maybe dating myself a little bit, but when I got started with marketing and revenue ops, it wasn't called marketing and revenue ops, say circa 2003. And the concepts like MQL and the waterfall were just coming out. Salesforce was just getting popularized. For the next 10 years is probably, you could say, is the golden age of marketing automation. You mean I can automate a nurture email series and I can have a CMS like WordPress and marketers can post content on there. So as demand gen was getting popularized, the process was you'd put a lot of forms on your website, serve some ads, and also search was starting to get popularized. So you drive traffic and then get leads, call them MQLs, which was a new term. Serious Decisions came out with then. Now they're run by Forrester. And so you would pass these MQLs over to sales and convert all of them to opportunities. And that was a very simplistic funnel back then. Then, maybe 2017, 2018, 2019, ABM started getting popularized. So the concept was, let's flip the funnel. Let's hunt with spears. Let's try to name the accounts we want to go after. So in that evolution, the concept of ideal customer profiling started to become into play as well. So along that spectrum, previously it used to be kind of where sales folks would just kind of guess the target accounts that they need to go after. Whereas today we're using things like machine learning to define the target accounts. So there's a lot of that evolution. So I think a pitfall along the way is to make the mistake that everyone's just going to come to your site and fill out a form. Since 80% of the buying is online now, there's a lot of ungated content. So you have to have mechanisms in place to de-anonymize the visitors, to do your account selection, to move away from more of a lead-based model called MQLs to more of this MQA. How do I treat a whole buying group? And I think oversight happens when I think people fail to make that shift if they are still buried in lead targets. Leads are still highly important, but there's a whole shift in your systems and technologies you have to implement to graduate from MQLs to MQAs. So I think that's, and it changes all the math in your funnel, your board reporting, everything. And so if you're not properly educated and the change management isn't in place to do such a change, I feel like you're setting yourself up for some surprises when you try to make the shift.
For sure.
So, Ali, Nick mentioned a pretty good roadmap of things to think about. I'm curious, where are you guys sort of in terms of rationalizing the market? That's really the first place that I feel like Nick is recommending. Let's be careful to understand ICP and segmentation. Where's the organization? How are you sort of building that into the foundation of how you're approaching
So
things?
I think we have a pretty clear view of who our buyers are. The things that we sell into the hospitals are very targeted to specific groups within the hospital. So we have our buyers there. And as far as like an ICP goes from an actual account perspective, it's a hospital. Like all hospitals buy very similar. We don't have a multi-vertical view. So there's not like the concept of ICP to me doesn't really apply here because we're selling to the same like niche TAM. What I think is going to be important for us is that we understand what the pain points are and what those signals are from those buying groups of showing intent and how they show intent for the things that we offer, those kinds of keywords that they're looking for. What are they calling the pain point that our solution solves for? Because I think that's where our real homework is going to come into play. Because I do feel like there might be a disconnect between how we think they like the terminology they use for their problem versus what we are addressing the problem as. So I think that might be one of the places that may cause us a little confusion. And also really like figuring out when it's a competitor versus us, and what if they're using that competitor. That's been a little bit of a struggle for us to know. There's not like a, like I could go to Built With when I worked at BigCommerce, and I could run a scenario all day long to know what e-commerce platform some companies are using. So I had this intelligence that I could bake into everything I was doing to know if they were already on a competitor, what kind of message do we provide them in terms of like trying to get them to convert to BigCommerce. It's a little bit harder in the hospital world because there's a lot of privacy issues. And so we don't know if they're using a solution. We don't know if they're just internally, aggregating data themselves. So it's a little bit harder in that regard.
That's so interesting. Yeah. So that, if you're selling a digital product, you could just have a website scraper that, and you could find out what competitors they're using or what complementary tools. It sounds like to really get intent and your segmentation, there's some data blind spots you're navigating.
Yeah, and I think that we're gonna have to just test and learn through that to make sure and see. And I'm kind of looking at this as like it's a pilot for us. I didn't sign like a multi-year agreement. It's a pilot, and we have to see if this even works in our space. If we can get enough data, we ran some data, like we tagged our website and did some sort of like pilot research before we signed anything. So we do see that they are surfacing data for the hospital accounts that we have. That's not the issue, which was always seemed to be the issue before. But my concern is that like, are the signals going to come through digitally the way that other companies' signals come through, so that we can pick them up and actually know that they're in market or not?
I mean, that's a lot. Gosh, I'm going to imagine this is a 2 or 3 year journey in terms of how you guys are planning the long-term transition. Ali, is that a fair estimate of what you guys are looking at to get to sort of the end from the traditional to maybe more of an intent and engagement based approach?
I think in reality, yes. I don't know that our leadership teams have realized that yet. But I mean, like anything, right? Transitioning to any new go-to-market strategy or any even like we launched CPQ for the first time last year. That's like a huge transition in our company from how we manage everything, from like how we sell to how we report out on revenue to how we treat our customers. Like it was a huge transition just doing that. And we're still like, we're like in our second phase of like, okay, we launched like this. Now we got to rethink about certain things that we've done. So then we're gonna like do almost like a second launch or like an update that changes like our approval process and things like that. Because now we see that we went to, we put this in place, and we were over architecting how we did our approvals, right? So I think like anything that we would do or any company does, it's always a journey. I think a lot of times leadership is like, but I want to see results 2 days from now, which is never a reality. So like our jobs as leaders is to really highlight like how we're going to get there, timelines, when we look at results and how we pivot based on those results, like really baking that part out so that there's clear communication and there's not an expectation that tomorrow we're going to have like pipeline for days that came from, this intent tool. So that to me is the bigger challenge than even, the
So
strategy.
interesting because, as RevOps, since you have the sales side and the marketing ops side, they're different beasts. So it sounds like CPQ, it's hard enough to get your internal folks to follow a new process and do a change behavior. Using intent and ABM, you're trying to get external hospitals to change their behavior. And so it's
Yeah.
definitely a longer process.
Whatever. We're just gonna go tackle things and try to make change the best way that we can.
Yeah.
Well, Nick, you created a perfect segue into what I wanted to ask you, which is because really what we're talking about here for Allie and her organization is they're starting at the top of the funnel, which I think is smart, right? In that at the end of the day, they have a really inefficient, sorry, Allie, I'm going to declare it inefficient because you're spending a lot of money to put people in the top of the funnel. And so they're sort of rightly saying, how do we lower the cost of bringing people into the funnel? Right now, we're doing very event-based. What if we can use an intent model? And I think if it's okay, Allie, I'll mention the fact that you guys recently acquired 6 Sense. You don't quite have access to the system yet, but you're thinking about right now, how do we deploy a single tool at the top of the funnel to help me lower the costs of recognizing who I should target? So Nick, with that in mind, we do this a lot. We help a lot of our clients, and you've done this in your past lives. Sort of what are some of the things to look out for in that transition? And we're doing it at Caliber Mind, right? We're implementing new intent-based models ourselves. So sort of what's the roadmap you give Allie in terms of making that top of funnel transition?
Yeah, and I imagine your sales cycle is what, a year, probably,
Oh, yeah, easily.
right?
These are multi-million-dollar deals.
Yeah, of course. So, yeah, as Doug said, we've been had some really nice success with ABM over the past year, and and informing. I think that the new flavor of ABM is to use intent to narrow down your TAM into which accounts do we want to deploy our resources against, and it's the in-market accounts. So you may use 6 Sense to select the accounts that are going to be your customers a year from now, and that's crazy to think about, or 3 quarters ahead. So that's I think you're spot on, is that it's a lot of it is managing the expectations of the leadership team, because of the sales cycle and the fact that in market still there's a lag between when you could convert an in market to an actual deal. There has to be some expectation setting, but also leading indicators. So you can't just say, all right, we know the accounts that are in market, check back in 3 quarters and we'll get back to you. Other ABM and intent experts I've spoken to, you look for other indicators, like within our target accounts, how many are coming to the website? That could be a leading indicator month over month. Did we drive a higher percentage of them to the website? Maybe they're not even opportunities yet, but now they're awareness. So I think it's about figuring out your KPIs and metrics at each stage of the funnel so that you can start to cohort this new intent qualified account list along the funnel. And that's something I don't think it's usually all about pipeline, and that is the number one goal. But ultimately, we have to look for early signals as well.
Early signals and where that pipeline's even coming from. I think for me, as part of RevOps with my marketing background, I mean, I'm always asking that question. Like, we've got X amount of pipeline, great. Where did that source come from, so that we can go double down on that, or see if there's ways that we can, do more of it, or do it cheaper, or how do we, capitalize on that in some way, where I think the sales guys are just like, I got pipeline, I'm gonna go sell it, And so I think that's part of the beauty of RevOps, is that we are looking at that full life cycle, and we're not just focusing on the sales part or the marketing part. We are the hub that's bringing it together.
Yeah. How many of those accounts would have came in anyway? And then, now you're talking about, do we need control groups, and do we need correlation analyses and incrementality studies? So, it's another, I think you're spot on, is like, we have to figure out, did we actually drive this engagement? Did we help do it? Or did we get lucky, and maybe they just came to our site, so interviewing customers, folks in the pipeline is a good way to triangulate some of that as well.
Yep.
What's really interesting is that in many ways, sort of we're representing two very different approaches to how to think about a multi-channel model. Nick is speaking to how do you create cohorts based on engagement score and based on their intent. So how do you sort of create this, if you will, digital funnel understanding of the buyer's journey? And that's the approach that Calibermind has taken, which is to say, hey, we're going to get the data and then we're going to sort of create and rationalize those cohorts ourselves. Ali, I think you very rightly and smartly have said, let's make that somebody else's problem. And I think that's sort of the beauty of what Sixth Sense does well for people at the top of the funnel, is they're very good. And some will counter and say it's a bit of a black box, but I think black boxes quite often make things simpler, which is that you can go, great, it's a 6QA. I'm going to load my ICP into Sixth Sense. I'm going to give them sort of criteria that might be just a straight data dump from Salesforce opportunities and leads, contacts. I uploaded, it comes back and goes, here's your ICP. Here's what we recommend you do at the top of the funnel. And it spits out SQAs for you. I'm oversimplifying
Yeah,
what you're going to have to deal with for the next
Can't
several
wait
months.
till it just
But they are
spits out
very,
magic.
Yeah.
by the way, I have stock in Sixth Sense. Thank you, Sixth Sense. Can I get my commission? But they're very, very different models, right? And so, Ali, my sense is overall that's part of the appeal of starting an intent transition by going, okay, let's have somebody else sort of worry about that. We can get sophisticated later in terms of the approach that Calibermind's doing in terms of sort of doing everything themselves.
Yeah. Agree. Like, I want to be Sixth Sense's best friend and have them tell me exactly what I go do, so that, and I'm thinking about it too in terms, since I'm the RevOps person, we are owning the tool and we are orchestrating everything. So we are saying, hey, marketing, this is what we're going to set up from you from an automated perspective. This is what we're seeing. So this is the type of messaging you need to, be ready for and be able to go and activate on. Hey, sales, we're seeing that there's activity based on, this data that we've shared with Sixth Sense. This is the ones that are in market. Hey, go activate on it. So we are acting like the, I don't know, what do you call the traffic people in the airport? The air traffic controllers. We're air traffic control of the signals of like, hey, you can go activate on this now. Hey, you can go activate on this now. That's how we're thinking about our role. So I don't really need to worry about messaging, but I can say this is what it's breaking down. These are like, say there's 4 different products or groups or buying signals that we're seeing about 4 different products. Go get those ready and make sure that we have messaging to address that, and go marketing, go give air cover, sales, go deep on those people and go reach out to them.
Yeah, to use a John Miller term, orchestration. You orchestrate the advertising, and at the same time, hey, these are the accounts you need to prospect into, and these are the plays you're going to run. And by the way, hey, we're going to have an executive connection on LinkedIn for these accounts. So it's becoming multi-threaded, and having RevOps centralized, I think is, a rare beauty of how you've organized your organization, because you have line of sight into all those different sheets of music and instruments.
Yeah,
I want to call it.
Sitting there at mission control personally.
And as you said on our prep call, handling the bee boops, Ali, we're going to steal that from you, by the way. I think it's beautiful. Whenever I hear a best practice on Funnel App Fridays, I always want to make sure we're calling them out. And so I want to make sure this is super clear. There's 2 things here I think that Ali and team are handling really well. The first thing is they're not trying to update the entire funnel all at once. They've decided to go after one portion of the funnel, and they're activating one thing at a time. They're being very deliberate. And I think that's very, very smart. And the second thing I want to call out is I might be going and saying, hey, this is the way we're doing it, and this is the way you're doing it, Ali, but you're making a choice. You're not trying to you're following a methodology, frankly, that's got a well-worn path and has had a lot of success for other folks. In other words, you're sort of saying, we're taking the Sixth Sense way. And so I wanted to call those 2 things out. Nick, are there other best practices you're hearing from Ali, or just generally things you would call out when it comes to what ultimately is not just a transition, it's a channel activation exercise that Ali's going through?
Yeah, that's spot on. Maybe she didn't say it in these words, but I implied it. Is activation means different things in different channels. And I think there's, when you say activate these 6 QAs in marketing, okay, is that advertising, nurture emails, and then how are you getting those lists onboarded into those different platforms to go after them, so to your spend is efficient. But activating for sales could be sales cadence. You might have to go to ZoomInfo or I don't know, that whatever data provider provides hospital administrator data. But
Definitive healthcare.
okay, yeah. So, and there's probably a cost to acquire those names, those cold names. And so there's a orchestration there that's the data integrity piece and seeding the database. And then there's a sales activation play. How do we prospect into these folks?
Yeah.
So I didn't want to gloss that over because you made a really good point around that. It's like activation should probably be across every channel. If you have an in-market account, you want to go all in to prove the value of the model first. And I'd almost lean to oh, err on the side of over marketing, overselling to these accounts, just so you can start to see this striation between non-6 QAs and 6 QAs and really try to prove them in cohorts. Hey, these ones are converting at twice the rate when we go all in. And then you can start paring back some of your channels to
Yeah,
make it more efficient.
I
But
agree.
like make them pronounced so you can prove the value to your executives and defend the investment. Maybe 6 Sense isn't ultimately the tool that's going to work for you, but you
Yeah.
got to give it the best shot to succeed, I think.
For sure, I want to give it the best shot, and I want to be just realistic. Like, we are in an unusual space. Our TAM is really tiny. We only sell to hospitals in the US and like a handful of global markets that don't have like socialized healthcare. So, it's just a little more niche than any other company that I've ever worked at, because I worked in the hosting space, e-commerce space, learning platforms like HR platforms. So all of those different realms of reality, you could sell into pretty much any other company. You can't do that here. So it took me a while when I first got here, when I saw like the size of our databases and the limited amount of our TAM, and I was like, I don't understand how you market, because all of marketing had been like basically like, bring all the people and pay all the money to the Googles and get them to your
Yeah.
website, right? Like, I was like, how does this even work? But it does. It
And
does. You
I'd
just
imagine,
gotta
and
think about it differently.
maybe this is the benefit is because you're selling to brick and mortar hospitals, ABM is really hard these days with everyone working from home to do direct mail. But maybe you can send pizzas to all the nurses one day and stuff like that. There's
Yeah.
probably benefits you can get to because they're all there.
Yeah, they're at a place.
Yeah.
I think we can do some things like that. There's also limitations around like
Okay.
gifting to a hospital.
Okay. Okay.
Like,
Okay.
there's a lot of gotchas in how we market, that I wasn't prepared for when I came in, and I was like, what do you mean we aren't doing, a traditional nurture? Why doesn't that work? So
I'm just thinking because
Well,
hospital
Ollie,
cafeteria, so.
yeah,
Ollie,
I'm sure they could
Nick
get
has
people.
two. Nick has 2 words for you: friendship bracelets. I'm not kidding. They've worked incredibly well for us in our motions. And Nick has always been the one bugging me, like, dude, we got to try this. We got to try it. And it's been
Yeah.
working. So cheers to Nick. So, Ali, when are we going to check in? When should we come back and see how that journey is going? This transition to the top of the funnel. Are we, I know with the executive team there, it's going to be next week, but what's
Right.
realistic? Are we talking fall? Would you come back in the fall and tell
I
us how
would
the journey's
probably
going?
come back in the fall, maybe like early winter, like the November timeframe, and really see like what movement we're seeing, and how it's going for us, and what new realm of interesting stuff is happening, because everything changes every minute.
Well, Ali, when I heard about what you guys were going through, I was super excited to get you on the show. We sort of get, quite often we get folks in here that are you sort of up, like they're at the control panel optimizing the ultimate journey. And when I heard about, and by the way, anybody who's listening in who has been in marketing for more than 10 years, you've experienced some part of this transition before, right? You've taken one of these sort of channels, and you've made it go online because it's cheaper and it's more effective and it's easier to track. So really appreciate you being on and being vulnerable and sharing what's happening for you. So we look forward to next week and your report on all the pipeline you produce. I'm kidding. We're looking forward to
All the
having you come back.
pipeline. We're kicking off in July, but we're going to have pipeline next week.
No doubt about it. We appreciate it. So, hey, folks, Nick, thank you for being with us again and sharing all your expertise. But that wraps up this episode of Funnel Lab Fridays. Eric Westerkamp, CEO and normal host, is going to be back next week. He's going to be back with Z Jeremick. If you have not heard from Z Jeremick at Mass Engines before, he is an expert in developing do-it-yourself attribution models. We're going to understand the difference between platform-based approach and that DIY approach.
Ooh,
Thank you, everybody, for
I'm
being with
gonna
us
tune
today.
into
Have a
that.
great day.
Thanks,
Ollie's
Sally.
in. Fantastic. Thanks everybody.
Bye.